Today, I will tell you the story of how I earned $700,000 after I broke up with my wife. She and her children ran to their lover, but after what I did, he left them. Before we start, my name is Thomas Bennett. If you had asked me a year ago to describe my life, I would have told you I was a happily married man. Victoria and I had been together for over 18 years, and I loved her deeply. We had two daughters, Sophia, 17, and Emily, 16, and I took immense pride in being both a husband and a father. Those roles meant everything to me. Back then, I truly believed I had built a good, stable life for my family. But now, I can't even bring myself to use the word proud when I think of my daughters. And calling myself happily married feels like some kind of sick joke. My life has become a hollow version of what it used to be. The truth is, I'm no longer married. And the pride I once felt for my girls has been replaced by something I don't even know how to describe. I've always been a hard worker, spending years as a chief engineer at a tool manufacturing plant. It's not the kind of job that turns heads, but it's honest work, steady, reliable. I put in long hours, took on extra shifts, solved problems, and did whatever I had to do to move up. But it was never for me. I never cared about flashy cars or exotic vacations. I did it all for them, for Victoria, for my daughters. I wanted to give them a home they could be proud of, a place where they felt safe and comfortable. I wanted them to have opportunities one never had growing up. I worked myself to the bone to make sure they had everything my paycheck could afford. Sometimes even more than that, if I had to stretch things a little. See, my parents had it rough. My father was a hardworking man, proud of what he built, but when the 1998 recession hit, he lost everything. I was just a kid, but I still remember the way he carried that weight, how it crushed him, even though none of it was his fault. My mother, God bless her, stood by him, never complained, never blamed him. She did whatever she had to do to keep us afloat. I remember the worst of it, when things got so bad that my dad had to sell our car just to get by. After that, he walked 2 miles to work every day, his briefcase in one hand. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but never with defeat. When he was too sick to walk, he'd take the bus, though even that felt like an expense we could barely justify. I grew up watching them struggle, watching them sacrifice. I knew what it meant to go without. There were so many times I turned down invitations from friends because I didn't want to ask my parents for money they didn't have. It wasn't their fault. They were doing the best they could. But as a teenager, that kind of thing sticks with you. I made a promise to myself back then. If I ever had kids, they'd never feel that kind of burden. I'd make sure money wasn't a constant worry for them. That's why I started working when I was just 15. While other kids were spending their weekends at the mall or playing video games, I was under the hood of a car at a local garage. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover my own expenses and take some of the pressure off my parents. I balanced that job with school, then college, where I managed to earn a full scholarship that paid my way through. I was determined to break the cycle of struggle that had shaped so much of my parents' lives. They didn't live to see the full reward of their sacrifices. They both passed away the year after I graduated. But I'll never forget the look on their faces the day I landed my first real job. My father, who had worked so hard only to lose so much, looked at me with a pride I'd never seen before. And my mother? She had tears in her eyes. The kind of tears that said, "We made it. You made it." One of the best days of my life was the day I handed her the keys to her very own car, bought with my own money. It wasn't brand new, not even close, but it was dependable, clean, and the best I could afford. I still remember how she ran her hands over the dashboard, as if making sure it was real. She cried that day, but it wasn't just happiness. It was something deeper. A sign that, after everything, the struggle had finally paid off. When she passed, I inherited the small house and the car. It wasn't much, but it was ours. It held every memory of my parents, their love, their sacrifices, and I believed it was what God intended. You don't argue with that. Life moves forward, even when you're not ready for it. That's when I met Victoria. She was smart, beautiful, full of energy. We hit it off right away, and before long, we were married. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to build the kind of life I'd always wanted. A life filled with love, stability, and purpose. Then came Sophia and Emily. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. I worked hard to provide, and while we weren't rolling in money, we had enough. I made sure to teach my girls the value of hard work, of knowing the difference between wants and needs. At least, I thought I had. That illusion shattered the afternoon I walked into the living room and saw Sophia holding a brand new iPhone in her hands. I froze, blinked, wondered for a second if my eyes were playing tricks on me. "Sophia," I said, pointing at the phone, "where did you get that?" She barely looked up, fingers still tapping away at the screen. "Mom got it for me," she said, as casually as if she were telling me what she had for lunch. I turned to Victoria, who was lounging on the couch, flipping through a magazine. You bought her that phone? She looked up, mildly annoyed that I was interrupting her. Yes, I did. What's the big deal? I just stared at her, trying to keep my voice level. The big deal is that I could barely afford the Android I gave her last year. That iPhone costs more than the first car I ever owned. Why would you buy her something like that without even talking to me first? She shrugged, closing her magazine and tossing it onto the coffee table. I saved money, Thomas. I had enough, so I got it for her. She's a teenager. All her friends have iPhones. I felt my chest tighten, heat rising inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. That's not the point, Victoria. It's not about whether you had the money or whether her friends have one. It's about teaching them the difference between necessity and luxury. An iPhone isn't a necessity. It's a luxury. She needs to understand that. Victoria sighed and leaned back against the couch. You're overreacting, Thomas. It's just a phone. It's not the end of the world. I opened my mouth, ready to argue. But the way Victoria casually flipped back to her magazine told me all I needed to know. This conversation was over. She had made up her mind, and there was no getting through to her. With a long exhale, I shook my head and walked away. Still, the frustration clung to me. It wasn't just about the phone. It was about everything that phone represented. The values I had tried so hard to teach my daughters, the lessons about responsibility and understanding the worth of a dollar, were slipping through my fingers. And Victoria? She brushed it off like it didn't matter. I let it go for the moment. But a few days later, I walked into the house and saw Emily, my youngest, holding the same brand new phone in her hands. I stopped in my tracks, the sight hitting me like a punch to the gut. I didn't hesitate. I marched straight over to her. Emily, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Where did you get that phone? She barely looked up, her fingers tapping away on the screen just like her sister had. Mom got it for me, she said, her tone light, casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't mad at her. This wasn't her fault. She was just a kid. Instead, I turned and walked straight to Victoria. Victoria, I started, keeping my voice steady even though my frustration was bubbling beneath the surface. Did you buy Emily an iPhone too? She didn't flinch, didn't even look guilty. Yes, I did. I told you. I save money. I stared at her, trying to process that answer. Save money? Victoria, where exactly are you saving this money? Because last I checked, we have bills to pay. We've got groceries to buy, a mortgage hanging over our heads. And you're telling me you somehow saved enough to buy not one, but 2 iPhones? Do you think I don't know how much those cost? Victoria let out a sigh, the kind that said she was done explaining herself. I don't see why this is such a big deal, Thomas. They're our daughters. I wanted to do something nice for them. Why do you have to turn it into some moral crisis every time I spend a little extra? I blinked at her. A little extra? Victoria, this isn't just a little extra. This is a luxury we don't need and can't afford. What kind of example are we setting for the girls? That they can have whatever they want, no matter the cost? That money just magically appears whenever they need it? Her expression hardened. You're overreacting, like always. I've got it handled, Thomas. You don't need to worry about it. The argument spiraled from there. I tried to get her to see reason, to understand my point, but it was like talking to a wall. She had her justifications, her excuses, and nothing I said made a difference. By the time the day was over, she was still angry, and I was sleeping on the couch. That night, I lay there staring at the ceiling, frustration gnawing at me. It wasn't just about the phones anymore. It was about something deeper. The lack of communication, the growing distance between us, the disregard for the values I had spent my life trying to uphold. It was clear now. We weren't just on different pages. We were in completely different books. The next morning, I went to work as usual, trying to shove the argument out of my mind and focus on my job. I had no idea that by the end of the day, my entire life would take a turn I never saw coming. We were all called into a meeting with upper management. It had that heavy atmosphere, the kind where everyone knows something bad is about to be said. The plant manager stood at the front, his face grim, and delivered the news. The plant was shutting down. All operations were being moved overseas to China. I sat there in stunned silence as he laid it all out. The company's executives had run the numbers, and apparently manufacturing tools overseas and importing them back to the US was more cost-effective. Profits over people, as always. And the only thing missing from their calculations? The lives of the workers who depended on that plant to survive. As furious as I was, there was one small silver lining. I wasn't losing my job immediately. As the chief engineer, I had 6 months left. My role now? To oversee the dismantling of the plant and later, to help set up 2 new ones in China. In fact, they even offered me a job there. But I wasn't about to uproot my entire life. leave everything I knew, and move halfway across the world. The message was clear. If I wasn't willing to relocate, I needed to start looking for another job. I walked through the front door that evening, my feet dragging, my head heavy with the weight of what had happened. To my surprise, Victoria actually noticed. There was a rare softness in her voice when she asked, "Thomas, what's wrong?" For once, I didn't have the energy to sidestep the question. I told her everything, how the plant was shutting down, the 6-month timeline, the offer to move overseas. She listened quietly, and for a moment, I thought she actually understood how much this meant. Then she looked at me and asked, "Would you consider moving to China?" I blinked, caught off guard. I hadn't even processed the idea yet. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't think it's something I'd want to do." Uprooting everything? Moving to a place where I don't even speak the language? It doesn't feel right. She didn't say much after that, but I saw the look in her eyes, like she wanted me to say yes. But she didn't push the issue, just nodded and went back to whatever she had been doing. For the next 3 months, I threw myself into work. Overseeing the plant's shutdown was exhausting. Physically, mentally, emotionally. Every day felt like a slow death, watching machines I had worked with for years being torn apart, coordinating teams, making sure everything was ready for the move to China. At home, something felt off. I was too distracted to see it at first. But then, one evening, I walked into the living room and saw Victoria sitting on the couch, casually scrolling through a brand new iPhone. I froze. A warning bell went off in my head. I could stomach her buying one for Sophia, and then another for Emily, even though I hated the idea. But for her to have one, too, that was different. That wasn't something she could brush off with "I saved money." 3 iPhones in just a few months? On my salary? That money wasn't coming from inside the house, which meant it had to be coming from somewhere else. Or worse, someone else. My mind spiraled into 1,000 dark places. Was Victoria involved in something illegal? I have heard stories how housewives entertain men and make money. Was she borrowing money from someone she shouldn't be? And what about the girls? Were Sophia and Emily mixed up in this too? My mind became a whirlwind of dark thoughts, each one worse than the last. Paranoia wrapped around me like a vice, layer upon layer of suspicion building until I could barely recognize my own reasoning. I needed to find out what was going on. I didn't have to wait long. A few days after seeing Victoria with that iPhone, my body finally gave in. The exhaustion from work, the stress of the plant shutting down, and the doubts clawing at my mind had all taken their toll. Feverish and weak, I was forced to stay in bed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything would somehow work out. The house was quiet except for the faint murmur of voices drifting in from the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the walls were thin, and their words carried right to me. "He got me a new earring," Victoria's voice floated through, light and almost giddy. My stomach twisted. He? Who the hell was he? "Wow, Mom, that's wonderful." That was Emily, her voice filled with admiration. "I want one too," Sophia chimed in, sounding every bit the entitled teenager. And then came the words that knocked the breath clean out of my lungs. "When are you gonna drop the bum and move in with Mr. Carter?" Emily asked, her tone dripping with a casual cruelty that I didn't even recognize. "I love his house. It's way bigger than this dump." Everything inside me went still. My own daughter, my own flesh and blood, had just called me a bum. The home I had worked myself to the bone to provide? A dump. The words struck like a sledgehammer to my chest. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The betrayal was suffocating, thick and inescapable. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My entire world, the one I had sacrificed everything for, was crumbling right in front of me. But I wasn't the kind of man to roll over and let people walk all over me. Not my wife. Not my daughters. The rules of this house had always been simple: respect, honesty, loyalty. And if this was how they truly felt, then I had no reason to let them stay under my roof a second longer. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself out of bed. My legs wobbled, my fever still weighing me down, but my mind was clear, crystal clear. I walked into the kitchen. The second they saw me, their conversation stopped dead. The air turned thick with tension. Victoria turned to me, flashing one of her well-rehearsed smiles. "Oh, honey, you're up," she said sweetly, as if nothing had happened. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, my eyes scanning the faces of the people I thought I knew. Sophia and Emily looked uncomfortable under my gaze. "Good." Victoria's smile faltered. "Yes, Victoria," I finally said, my voice steady, controlled. "The bum is up." That was when I saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Good," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "Now, I want you to pack your bags and get out of this house. Immediately. I'll be filing for divorce, and you can let me know where Mr. Carter's mansion is so I can send you the papers. Victoria's mouth opened, probably to protest, but I wasn't done. Also, I added, my eyes locking onto Sophia and Emily, who sat frozen in their chairs. Since I know the court won't give me custody of these two little devil spawns, you might as well take them with you. That seemed to shake them. Emily was the first to stand, her face contorted with disdain. Who wants to stay with a loser like you anyway? She spat. Sophia, always quick to follow her sister's lead, sneered. Yeah, Mr. Carter has way more money than you. And at least he doesn't try to cover up his incompetence with crap about values. Their words should have hurt. They should have cut deep, but I felt nothing. I stood slowly, my gaze shifting back to Victoria. Well then, I said, voice firm, unwavering. Victoria, tell your Mr. Carter that since he's so rich, he can have you as his wife, or whatever arrangement you prefer. And these two brats as his legally adopted daughters. I'll be signing over my parental rights immediately. The room went silent. Victoria's face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes as she stepped toward me, reaching out like she had just remembered she cared. Thomas, please, she said, her voice trembling. I love you. I don't want a divorce. Let's talk about this. We can fix it. I stared at her, unmoved. Where was that love when you were sneaking around, accepting gifts from another man? I asked coldly. Where was that love when you let our daughters spit on the man who worked himself to the bone for them? She sobbed harder, but I didn't care. I was done. Done being disrespected. Done pretending this marriage was anything more than a pile of broken lies. Without another word, I reached for my wedding ring, the once precious symbol of a commitment that no longer existed. I slid it off my finger and placed it on the table, the metal making a soft clink against the wood. Then, I walked to the toolbox in the corner. Victoria's sobs turned into startled silence as I pulled out a hammer. I came back to the table, picked up the ring, and without hesitation, slammed the hammer down onto it. The sound rang through the kitchen like a gunshot. The gold bent and twisted under the force, no longer a perfect circle, but a broken, useless scrap of metal. I held it up, staring at it for a moment before tossing it toward Victoria. Here, I said, my voice steady, laced with a bitter finality. I know you can still sell it for the gold. The tears in her eyes dried up instantly, her sadness replaced with fury. Her face twisted in rage, the mask of grief slipping away completely. So this is how you want to play, she hissed. I didn't answer. She spat the words at me, her voice rising, dripping with venom. Fine. I'll wreck you in court. I'll make sure you regret this day for the rest of your miserable life. Then she spun on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen. Sophia and Emily followed close behind, their faces twisted with disdain and something else, smug satisfaction, as if they'd won something, as if they had just defeated me. I didn't stop them. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, watching as they disappeared upstairs to pack their things. With each step they took, the house felt heavier. Yet, strangely, for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. Later that evening, the door slammed behind them as they left. I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching them load their bags into a car and drive away, presumably heading to Mr. Carter's house, whoever the hell he was. Victoria was true to her word. In court, she came at me like a hurricane, tearing through everything I had built. I stood there, powerless, as the judge divided my life into pieces and handed them to her. My 401k, gone. Every penny of my hard-earned savings, wiped out. The joint account, now hers. And on top of all that, a mountain of alimony payments that would bleed me dry unless Victoria decided to marry her shiny new benefactor. Child support? Another chain around my neck, set to last until both girls turned 18. The only things I was allowed to keep were the house and my car. A hollow victory. The house felt empty now, stripped of the laughter, the warmth, the family it once held. The car? Just a machine. A tool to take me from one place to another. None of it felt like much of a win. I walked out of the courtroom feeling like the weight of the world had been dropped onto my shoulders. And that's when I saw him for the first time. Jonathan Carter. The man who had bought his way into my family. He stood there, arm in arm with Victoria. Sophia and Emily clung to him like they had found some better version of a father. They were wrapped in a family hug. The kind of moment I had fought for, worked for, bled for. But now, it belonged to them. Without me. Did it hurt? Of course it did. It was like a knife twisting in my chest, a brutal, gut-wrenching reminder of what I had lost. But would it break me? Hell no. If anything, it only confirmed what I had already come to realize. I had just rid myself of bad people. People who didn't value loyalty, integrity, or love the way I did. People who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone. Some might ask why I didn't fight harder for my daughters. Why I didn't drag the case through the courts, demand custody, force them to stay with me. The truth? By the age of 16, a child's mind is almost fully formed. Emily and Sophia were nearly there. Even if I had fought tooth and nail, they wouldn't have chosen me. Their loyalty had already been bought, with luxury, with comfort, with an easier life. They had already made their choice. Still, I wasn't about to slink away with my tail between my legs. I walked over to them, each step heavier than the last. They turned to look at me as I approached. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice cold, victorious. I told you, I'd wreck you. Then Emily, her words dripping with cruelty. Like I said earlier, Dad, she spat the word out like it was an insult. You're a loser. Asterisk. It was a gut punch, but I swallowed the pain. I wasn't about to show them even one more ounce of weakness. I turned to Sophia, hoping for something, some flicker of guilt, some shred of the little girl who once ran to me when she was scared. But she just stood there, silent. She had already chosen her side. Then there was him, Jonathan Carter, that smug bastard, standing there with his ever-present grin, like he had won. No hard feelings, buddy, he said smoothly. They deserve better things in life. You just weren't able to keep up. I stood there, absorbing everything, the betrayal, the arrogance, the way he so easily dismissed my role in their lives. Then I did something he didn't expect. I smiled. It didn't reach my eyes, but it was there. You're absolutely right, buddy, I said, my voice even. So I guess you'll be adopting these two by next week? Or will they still be brought up on my dime? Jonathan didn't flinch. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I'm a man of my word, he said, handing it to me. The paperwork is already in process. If you care to sign, it'll all be official. I took the envelope, my hands steady, even as my heart cracked just a little deeper. I looked over the papers, saw exactly what they were. Without hesitation, I signed. It was over. There was no going back. I handed the papers back to him, and he gave me a copy. I have a lawyer, he said casually. He'll get this processed quickly. You can use the other copy to close the child support. He paused, that smug grin widening. Oh, and I'll be marrying Victoria next week. You're invited. I looked at him, looked at her, and I couldn't help but smirk. Well, congratulations, I said, voice thick with sarcasm. I hope this time, Victoria doesn't find a richer man than you. Victoria opened her mouth, probably to argue, probably to deny it. But the words never came, because she knew I was right. She had traded up once. What would stop her from doing it again? Jonathan might have thought he won. But the truth? He was just the next fool in line. Just like that, child support and alimony were gone. Every financial tie between us? Severed. It was as if I had been erased from their lives entirely. 3 months later, everything was finalized. I didn't attend the wedding. Why would I? That wasn't my life anymore. That wasn't my family anymore. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. Some might think that was the end of my story, that I'd just accept my fate, move on with my hollow victory, and fade into the background. But something inside me said otherwise. Revenge. So I started digging, and that's when I found it. Jonathan Carter, the same man who had taken everything from me, wasn't just some rich businessman. He was one of the majority shareholders of the company I worked for. I had heard his name before, but never paid it much attention. But now it all made sense. He had bought the company's shares 8 months ago, right around the time everything started falling apart. The plant closure, the move to China. Jonathan Carter wasn't interested in making the company more efficient or profitable. He was playing a game. He bought shares at a higher price, fully aware that by shifting operations overseas, he could later sell the company for an even bigger profit. As long as the product quality remained the same, his plan would work. But I found out the tools made at the China plant weren't just lower in quality. They actually broke after only a few days. The company was on a path to failure, and the lenders and creditors were about to lose everything. This wasn't the first time Jonathan Carter had done this. He had pulled the same stunt with 2 other companies before mine, running both into the ground. The result? He walked away rich while the employees were left with nothing. Maybe I was just a small-time chief engineer in their eyes, but I wasn't an idiot. I understood business, and I could see through his scheme. It was the same old trick. He took out loans, bought the company, then dismantled the plant. The machines were either sold off as scrap or resold to other companies, bringing in some quick cash. But the real deception was how he moved the money around, making it seem like he was investing in improving production and cutting costs. In reality, he was paying his own companies as vendors, pocketing the profits while the banks lost their money and the employees were left jobless. So how did I figure all this out? Well, I was tasked with helping to dismantle the company, and that's when I met the vendor taking away the machines. The company, Scrap Metal Private Limited, was owned by a man named Alastair Carter, Jonathan's brother. On paper, they were buying the machines as scrap, but in reality, the machines were in perfect condition. Later, I discovered that Scrap Metal Private Limited had sold them to one of our competitors at a 60% discount for market value. I wasn't about to sit on this information. I sent an anonymous email to the banks and lenders, detailing the entire scheme. But the email didn't stop there. It found its way to the local newspaper and, surprisingly, to the mayor's office. And what politician in an election year would ignore a business scandal happening in their city? None. And what mayoral candidate wouldn't take the chance to blame the sitting mayor for letting it happen? It was classic politics. The timing was perfect. They weren't going to let this slide. I knew it was risky, but it was also my best move. Jonathan Carter had taken everything from me, but now he was going to face the consequences. It only took a week before the IRS, FBI, Department of the Treasury, and Federal Trade Commission got involved. The investigation into Jonathan Carter's shady dealings quickly became a full-scale federal matter. And here's something I couldn't believe myself. Like I said before, God works in mysterious ways. One evening, I was at Krauser's picking up some groceries when, on a whim, I decided to buy a scratch-off ticket, the first one I'd ever bought. It might sound crazy, but when I scratched it off, I couldn't believe my eyes. I had won $700,000. After taxes, I was left with $444,000, more than what I had lost in the divorce. The best part? It was all mine. It felt surreal. After everything I had been through, the betrayal, the losses, the struggle, it was as if life had finally decided to throw me a break. That money wasn't just luck. It was a sign. A sign that sometimes, in its own strange way, life balances things out. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Alastair Carter were both under investigation. Their good life, and Victoria's and the girls, took a nosedive. Suddenly, I was getting calls from Victoria and the girls every day. I ignored them. They had made their choices. Now, it was my time to focus on me. With the plant shut down and the mayor ensuring that everyone was still getting paid, I took the opportunity to remodel my house. After a week of work and about $50,000, my home looked incredible. I even put in a small heated pool in the backyard. My health improved, my mood lifted, and for the first time in years, I actually felt good about where my life was heading. And then, just when I thought I could finally enjoy my peace, they showed up. Victoria and the girls were at my door, banging like they were about to break it down. I opened it, and before I could even say a word, Victoria barged in, nearly knocking me aside. "Where did you get the money for this?" she demanded. Before I could answer, Emily was already wandering through the house. "My room is gone, and now there's a giant TV in here. It looks like a home theater," she called out, shocked. Sophia had made her way to the backyard. "Holy crap, there's a pool," she gasped in disbelief. I quickly stepped between them. "Hold on. What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Victoria turned to me, her face twisted with anger. "You stole money from me. I want my share." I stared at her and let out a slow, cold smile. "Victoria, you're married," I said. "And now you're here demanding money from another man? You must be smoking something." Her face flushed with rage. "You think you can just get away with everything? I know what you did, and I want my part of that fortune." I crossed my arms, feeling a deep sense of control that I hadn't felt in years. "If you want money, maybe you should try asking your new husband, Jonathan. I'm sure he's got plenty of cash lying around for you." Emily rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, this is so pathetic. Just give her the money, Dad." I turned to Emily, irritation bubbling to the surface. "Shut up, Emily. Don't call me that anymore. You made your choice, and it's too late for second chances. Besides, legally, I'm not your dad anymore." Sophia chimed in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, why don't you just hand over the cash and let's all move on, Dad?" I clenched my jaw. The words stung more than I cared to admit, but I wasn't about to let them get under my skin. "You know what? Get out. All of you. I don't need this from you. Get out now, or I'll call 911. Victoria looked shocked for a second, but then her face twisted with anger. "This isn't over, Thomas. You'll regret this." I shot back, "No, Victoria. You're the one who'll regret it. You walked away from me, remember? You chose money over everything else. So go back to it. And if you dare take me to court, I will wreck you this time." I already knew Victoria would try to take legal action, but I was ready. I had gone over everything with my lawyer and saw it coming from a mile away. When we were in the courtroom, Victoria sat there, looking as entitled as ever. She claimed I hadn't given her enough of my assets and that I had hidden money from her. My lawyer remained calm and methodical, laying out all the facts before the judge. He explained how I had acquired my sudden wealth, proving that it was legitimate and earned fair and square. The judge, flipping through the case files, finally looked up at Victoria. "Do you have any evidence that Mr. Bennett hid money from you?" he asked in a steady, no-nonsense tone. Victoria hesitated, then stammered. "Well, no, but—" The judge didn't even let her finish. "Then I'm afraid there's nothing to support your claim." He glanced at the papers in his hands and continued, "Now, about your request for alimony." Before he could finish, both Sophia and Emily jumped up, shouting at the same time. "He abandoned us," Emily yelled, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "You're a coward." "Yeah, you just left us," Sophia added, her eyes burning with anger. The judge let out a heavy sigh, clearly exhausted by their outburst. He removed his glasses and peered over them at the two girls before turning his attention back to Victoria. "Mrs. Carter," he said firmly, "you are currently married to Mr. Jonathan Carter. According to these records, I see no reason to grant you any further money from Mr. Bennett." Victoria's face twisted in disbelief. She opened her mouth to protest, but the judge wasn't finished. "As for these two young ladies," he said, motioning toward Sophia and Emily, "since Mr. Jonathan Carter has legally adopted them and Mr. Bennett has transferred all parental rights, he is no longer responsible for them. This case for additional alimony is dismissed." I let out a breath I didn't even realize I had been holding. Victoria was defeated. The judge's ruling shut down her demands completely. I watched as she tried to find the right words, but nothing came out. She just stood there, fuming, her face red with frustration. But it didn't matter. It was over. The judge had spoken, and there was nothing she could do about it now. The calls from Victoria and the girls didn't stop, but something had changed. The entitlement and anger in their voices were gone, replaced with desperation. I agreed to meet them one final time, but on my terms. I wanted control over the situation. The only place I was willing to meet them was at my lawyer's office. I wasn't taking any chances. Not with them. Not anymore. They showed up dressed in their best clothes, trying to act like they still had some power. But I saw right through it. I sat across from them, placing my sleek black Android phone on the table. The same one I had bought after my sudden windfall. Under the bright office lights, the screen gleamed. Victoria's eyes flicked to it immediately. "You've changed, Bill," she said, almost in disbelief. I smiled, my gaze steady. "All thanks to you and Mr. Carter's daughters." Victoria's face hardened. "They're your daughters, Bill." I slowly raised my hand and reached into the folder my lawyer had prepared. Pulling out a piece of paper, I slid it across the table to her. "As per this document," I said evenly, "they are not my daughters." Victoria looked down at the paper, her expression faltering. What is this?" I watched as her confusion turned to realization. Her eyes scanned the signature at the bottom of the page, the one that sealed the deal. Her husband's signature. "It has your husband's signature on it," I said coldly. Her eyes welled up, her voice shaking. "Does a piece of paper make him their father?" she asked, barely keeping it together. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I was done feeling anything for her or them. My anger had long since burned out, leaving behind only one thing: the cold, hard truth. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "It does." I let the words sink in before adding, "That's exactly what you taught me, Victoria. You were the one who chose money over everything. You became another man's wife for paper money. My daughters called me a bum because I had less paper money. They mocked my home because it didn't measure up in paper money. So yes, when it comes to you and your daughters, it's all about papers." Both Emily and Sophia started crying, their voices shaky. "I'm sorry, Dad." I didn't even flinch. The old emotions, the guilt, the longing for the family we once had, were gone. Now, I felt nothing. "Shut up," I snapped, my voice sharp. "And if you call me Dad one more time, this meeting is over. You are not my daughters. If you want to call someone your father, that's Jonathan Carter. Not me." They fell silent, their sobs quieting into choked breaths. But it wasn't enough for them to cry. Their apologies meant nothing to me. I had nothing left for them. Nothing to give. Finally, Victoria spoke. Her voice was shaky, like she was struggling to hold onto the last shred of her dignity. "We're getting divorced," she admitted, her eyes locking onto mine with a desperate plea. "He wants to get rid of me. We had a prenup, and now I'll be out on the street, with my daughters." "There. Are you happy now?" I stared at her, and the anger I had buried for so long began to surface again. But this time, it wasn't fiery or loud. It was cold, sharper. "No, Victoria. He's not trying to get rid of you," I said, my voice like steel. "You were trying to get rid of him." And now that he's looking at jail time, and you know you won't see a single penny, you want to cut ties and come running back to me, just because I have money now. I let out a bitter laugh. You disgust me. Her lip quivered, but she wasn't done. I was your wife for years, Bill. They're your daughters. We'll be on the streets. How will you feel about that? She asked, her voice soft, almost calculated. I didn't hesitate. Not my wife. Not my daughters. Not my problem. I let the words sink in before I continued. You want money? Get a job. Need a job? Go find one. But don't come running to me. I'm not your doormat anymore. I stood up, my patience completely gone. If I ever find you near my house, or anywhere near me, I will file a restraining order and have you locked up. My gaze was locked onto them, unflinching. Victoria and the girls tried to put on a show, crying, pleading, doing everything they could to make me feel something. But I didn't. I wasn't moved. Not anymore. They had made their bed, and now it was time for them to sleep in it. I turned away without another word, not even sparing them a final glance. As for Jonathan Carter and his brother, they got exactly what was coming to them. The investigation brought their empire crashing down. They lost their wealth, their status, everything. Of course, I had no doubt they had millions stashed away in offshore accounts. But with the kind of sentences they were facing, it wouldn't do them any good. They wouldn't be able to enjoy that money in this lifetime. And with no family, no kids to pass it down to, all of it was as good as wasted. But the Carters weren't entirely stupid. They made what was probably the smartest move of their lives. They cut a deal with the government. The authorities got the money, and in exchange, the brothers would be out of prison in a few years instead of a few decades. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that God has his own way of settling the score. Because while the Carter brothers were behind bars, they ran into some familiar faces, men who had once worked at the factories they had shut down, men whose lives had been ruined by their greed. And let's just say, by the time they were done with Jonathan and Alistair, neither of them would ever walk straight again. It wasn't a courtroom verdict, but it was justice all the same. As for me, I've made my peace. I've accepted that marriage isn't in my future. I've been through enough to know I don't need that kind of complication in my life again. And you know what? I'm happy. My life is quiet, but that doesn't mean it's empty. The house used to feel big and hollow, but now, I've got 2 German shepherds as my roommates. They've brought a kind of warmth I never expected. I haven't heard from Victoria in a long time, and to be honest, I don't care to. Both of my ex-daughters work at a local cafe now, making an hourly wage. They have their own lives, and that's fine. I never wished anything bad on them, but I've also learned not to wish anything bad on myself either. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.